to the C.S. Joseph podcast. I'm your host, John, and today we're going to do episode 2 of the How to Deal with Other People's Critic series. And today we'll be talking about the ESTP and the ENTP and how to deal with their critic, their extroverted thinking critic. So to recap from the intro episode, one of the reasons we're doing this series is based on a post that someone in the Facebook community did a few years ago, basically making the point that, if you're going to get the respect of new people, new people that you meet, it's not as much about the exchange of the hero or the child or even the parent, even though that's involved. It really is about a test of the critic. Can you pass the test of the critic, right? And TE critic is critical of other people's thoughts, other people's beliefs, and really other people's capacity for thinking clearly, for thinking well. And this leads both ESTPs and ENTPs to really be dismissive and critical of other people's thinking, right? We have probably all experienced it when you're in a conversation with an ESTP or an ENTP and they've decided for whatever reason that you don't know what you're talking about, or that you haven't done as much research as they have, or that they can just dismiss you because, maybe they think you're silly or just not mature in your thinking, right? So in order to really understand how to speak to their TE critic, we have to understand what's causing the critical outlook to begin with. And that's our first point here, and that is the connection between the critic and the parent. So in this series, while our main focus is going to be about the critic, we can't really talk thoroughly about the critic without talking about the circuit that it's related to, the critic, the parent, the child, and the trickster, right? And I want to keep it simple. I don't want to go through all 4 pieces of the circuit in depth. But the closest connection to the critic is the parent, and the parent and the critic are in this cognitive orbit connection, right? They have this synergy. And this is sort of the main secret, the first reason why TE critic, it can be so dismissive of other people's thinking, right? Because the TI parent of the ETPs is so responsible, is so careful, it carries the burden of having to be precise, having to be thoughtful with their logic, right? So this link between responsibility and being critical is really pronounced with all of the critic functions, but especially with TE critic and TI parent. So that's sort of the reason why TE critic is so can be so dismissive of other people's thinking, because the ENTP or the ESTP knows that, hey, I'm putting in all this effort, all this time. I have the burden of being responsible with the truth, or responsible with logic. And they see and they project, but they also see other people not being as careful or not being as responsible with their thinking as the ENTP or the ESTP is, right? And that's sort of why there's this risk of this link between the parent and the critic, leading to this link between responsibility and bitterness. And if you think about the critic as an archetype whose energy is sort of the negative output of responsibility, that there is a risk of inherent bitterness when someone is responsible and they see everyone else being irresponsible, especially for the ENTP with their deadly sin of envy. When they're all about their duty and being responsible, especially with their thinking, and they see other people living what they imagine to be better lives, easier lives, more fulfilled lives, even if those people aren't as responsible, right? And that's where, both as a general archetype for all the types, but also for these specific types, the link between, burdening your responsibility leading to bitterness is something that every type is going to have to deal with. So for dealing with and connecting with the ESTP and the ENTP in the way of their critic function, it really comes down to one main thing, which we covered in the intro lecture, and that is the critic is looking for proof of effort. Why? Because the critic is that old, that old elderly person sewing on their rocking on their rocking chair and sewing and looking at the world and being like, things aren't as they used to be, and just sort of looking at everything in a dismissive, negative way of, the whole world's going to hell and I'm not going to do anything about it because no one's going to listen to me, because people are just going to do their thing, right? But if the ENTP or the ESTP still has some life left in their critic, which we all do, even if it's really far down, what it comes down to is proof of effort. And remember, one of the last points that we finished off in the intro lecture, in the intro episode, was really what the critic wants deep inside them is to reconnect with the spirit of the child. Because if you look at cognitive reflection, right, in this case, the battleground of responsibility, actually the battleground of innocence between the critic and the child. If you start on both sides of the reflection function, the critic up here, the child up here, down here, the path of integration, the path of life, when it's done meaningfully, these two archetypes are going to be able to eventually exchange some of their energy because they're looking to become at least partially like the other one, right? The child's wanting to grow up and to be wise like the critic. And the critic, in its youth, in its stiffness, in its elderly state, is looking for youth and rejuvenation again, right? So, but the way that TE critic experiences this rejuvenation from other people, and the way to get most ESTPs and ENTPs not to dismiss you outright, it really comes down to intellectual humility mixed with curiosity, okay? So, ENTPs and ESTPs, when they become wise with their TE critic, they have to learn to not just tell people that they're wrong, tell people that they're right, but really take on the teaching role, where it no longer becomes as much about, hey, I know the truth and this is it, but more about using the wisdom of their critic to put out this intellectual pathway, this perspective, this set of questions and input that can lead people to the truth. Because what the wisdom of TE critic learns, if they learn it, is that if you force wisdom on someone, if they don't get to discover it for themselves, it's probably not going to really stick. So the ESTP and the ENTP kind of learn to take a step back a little bit and be like, I need to, especially with certain people, I need to become more of this teacher, more of this educator, rather than just, this logical, you're wrong, you're right, etc., right? So proof of effort for TE critic is intellectual humility and intellectual curiosity. One of the main ways to deal with TE critic is to invite them to sharpen and improve your thinking, okay? TE critics often they stumble over labels. Like, why is it called that? That doesn't make sense. Or that could make more sense. Or that label is ambiguous, right? So it's an invitation to let them refine your thinking, refine your perspective, and refine your input, basically. So, if you're doing a research project, or you're working for an ESTP or an ENTP, or you're working with these types, maybe you're in school and you have a classmate or a professor, it's really a matter of, in some way, surrendering to their perspective. Now, it's not that you give up your right to thinking. No, it's more that intellectually you take on the role of the student more, especially in disciplines that they know more, that they may be expert in, right? And it's not to say, again, to emphasize, it's not to say that you intellectually just step out of the way, because then they'll just bulldoze you potentially, and then probably the critics can lose respect for you anyway. It's this kind of balance between surrendering to their insight and to their input of like, hey, what do you think about this? Oh, okay, your criticism of that makes sense. Let's think about some ways to refine that, to make that better, right? So it's a combination of that, and then kind of pushing back a little and inserting your own thoughts, because TE critics, as long as they're not completely gone, they don't mind listening, right? Just like all TI users in general don't really mind listening, as long as their thoughts are invited first, right? Or at least considered, held as valuable, right? And I think a big misunderstanding, I think of all the types, this is most misunderstood of the TE critics. Some ESTPs and ENTPs do have a harder time listening, right? But in general, when you invite their thoughts, when you give them an invitation to refine your thinking or refine a point, they're willing to listen, right? And they're willing to dialogue back and forth. And if you think about, one of the most famous ENTPs of all time, Socrates, right, and his Socratic method and the wisdom of his TE critic, it was all about talking back and forth, right? It wasn't just about his TI parent just blasting people, right? His critic was, in my opinion, searching for signs of life, for signs of other people's willingness to actually search for the truth and put in the effort to consider other people's thoughts, right? The critic is kind of looking for other people to take on its burden, right? Because that is what allows it to have less burdens and be able to experience youth again. So if ENTPs and ESTPs can trust you to think well, to think clearly, to think thoroughly, to be willing to put in the effort to do research, to ask them questions, to seek out people who know a lot about a particular topic, it's a relief to them, right? Because the critic, one of the reasons it can get bitter is because it's just it feels crushed by the responsibility to educate and to guide people who are not willing to be guided or taught, right? So when you are someone who is willing to be taught, willing to be refined by a TE critic, boy, does it create a relief in the ESTP and the ENTP. And just to reiterate, even though these types may label a certain thought as, oh, that's stupid, that's silly, in general, they don't really mind if you don't know a lot, or if you maybe aren't the clearest thinker yet. What they mind, what they're searching for is proof of life, proof of effort, proof of this person's open enough to walking the path to improve their thinking. In some ways, no one is more forgiving than the critic. Just as in other ways, the critic is one of the most demeaning, right? But for the ones who show a demonstration, who show a willingness to be humble and to be curious, I think these are the ones who are most likely to cause relief, to create relief for the ESTP and the ENTP, right? So to wrap up here, there's one last point, and that's to come back to cognitive reflection. And I think this is sort of maybe a secret or a shortcut, but also I think a really meaningful way to engage and speak to their critic and to their inner child at the same time. And that is speaking to the child through the critic. So I have this sentence here: your research helped me. Your research helped me a lot. The things you taught me helped me a lot. Mature ESTPs and ENTPs take it upon themselves to always be reading or listening to something or being in conversations, to always be taking in more input, right? And the connection between the critic and the child is that when the ETPs know a lot about a certain topic, right, and they have to use their critic to teach you, which can be exhausting, but it's all, it's usually okay for a little while. If you take that information and you embody it and you use it well, right, and then you report back, hey, your research, your insight here, your perspective here helped me a lot and solve this problem for me, or help me fix this health issue, or now my gym experience, I'm lifting a whole lot more now at the gym, or whatever it may be, in any physical, mental, emotional, psychological, spiritual domain, right, in which an ETP may know something about, even if it's business, whatever. That sentence, hey, your research or your insight helped me a lot, and then talking about how it helped you and how it changed your perspective, and how you're integrating their opinion, right, their input into your own mind. That's sort of the proof of life for these types, right? It's how their critic gets to experience youth, where when their research TE critic becomes helpful to you, FE child, right? And then they feel valued, and then they feel relieved with their critic, like, oh my God, someone's listening, thank God, right? Someone's putting in the effort to improve their thinking, right? So anyway, that's the end of this lecture. I wanted to make it kind of short. I'm hoping to keep these short to give you guys a few points and kind of a general perspective of how to interact with other people's critic functions. And we started off here with the ENTP and the ESTP. So let me know what you think in the comments. Tell me about your guys' experience with TE critics, or your own experience if you are one, and maybe you have found other things that have helped your interactions with these types. So anyway, thanks for tuning in, folks, and we'll see you guys in the next video.